What are the forces, challenges, and ideas that define the 21st century? Conversations to understand the greatest figures and stories of today to create a better tomorrow. This is the 21st Talks podcast. Hey, how is it going, everybody? My name is Coleman Snell. Welcome to the 21st Talks podcast. This is episode 1, and this is actually an interview that I did with Adrian Currie, Professor Dr. Adrian Currie, I should say, about a month and a half ago. But I wanted to re-release it under the new podcast branding and title. It was under a different one before, and unfortunately, not a different title in the sense of lordship or baronship. Unfortunately, I haven't been lorded or knighted yet. And if anyone out there can change that, please let me know. My email is always open. But we just got some new branding down, we built a new website and did all of that stuff to be able to start bringing these weekly episodes to you guys. And this podcast is going to be a series of conversations with some great academics, thinkers, and artists in the 21st century. We're not going to time travel, so it's kind of the only type of interviews we can do. Unless if we can do this podcast for more than 100 years, then the 22nd century podcast might be a thing then. But we will see. But nonetheless, the 21st Talks podcast is going to be talking about everything that contributes to and changes and modifies and threatens and succeeds and everything having to do with life in the 21st century. It is a weird time to be alive, and there's not a good series of lessons or footnotes from anything other than all of history and all philosophy and all psychology and all these other places. That's just a whole lot of information to digest. So we're going to try and make that a little bit easier by talking to some brilliant people every week, and hash out some fun ideas about what the future of our species might look like, what the future of the world might look like, how we can do better as a species, what existential risk is, what ideas from philosophy and psychology can actually help us in our day-to-day life, and hopefully peel back the narratives that intertwine themselves with our day-to-day lived experience, and see how we can hash out better ones. The progress of society, in my opinion, is something that comes down to what stories we're telling ourselves, and the 21st century is going to have a lot of opportunities from risks, technology, and political shifts to craft some very new, very much so needed new narratives about the world and who we are and how we fit into it. So please join me in that mission, in that epic quest, and come back next week to listen to the next episode. So thank you guys for watching or listening, and remember to like, rate, and subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to this to. But thank you guys very much, and it means a lot to me. So today's guest is Adrian Currie, who is a lecturer at the University of Exeter in the UK, and he was also a researcher at the University of Cambridge's Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, otherwise known as CSER. And he's actually one of a couple CSER researchers or past researchers I've had the chance to interview so far, and it's a brilliant lot. And I'm really excited to release this conversation to you. I think it captures something about what I want this podcast to be, its interdisciplinary nature, and really the types of discussions I want to have about understanding the forces and situations that explain why the world is what it is today, and where we're going, where our future is, and for reasons for why it shouldn't be seen as so stark. There's reasons for hope out there. And that doesn't mean that we can ignore the big disasters. It means we actually have to stare them right in the eyes. But we'll also get there through talking about philosophy, psychology, art, history, all of that fun stuff. Thank you guys so much for listening, and let's go ahead and jump right into it. I really appreciate having you on today. I wanted to ask you, what initially got you interested in both paleontology as well as existential risk?
Great. Well, both have extremely unsexy answers. So the first, how did I start thinking about paleontology? So I want to say something like, I was really into dinosaurs as a kid. It was, just this passion for me. I mean, I was into dinosaurs as a kid as much as anyone. Like I can rattle off various names of the various dinosaurs and I can identify them okay. But I really wasn't, when I was, an undergraduate or when I was in later high school, I wasn't particularly interested in paleontology. I was much more artsy rather than sciencey. But then sadly, through philosophy, I developed an interest in paleontology. So as I sort of became more convinced that if you want to understand knowledge, a really important thing to understand is science, that led me to think about science. And I sort of then, through my PhD, discovered the sort of wonderful world of the science of paleontology, archaeology, and the earth sciences, geology, which were extremely under-examined by philosophers of science. And so I sort of thought, well, let's think about it that way. And so the reason I got into paleontology was for philosophical reasons, which is kind of a bit odd. The reason I got into catastrophic risk, in full honesty, was there was a job. And I thought, I haven't thought very much about that, but I can see connections between the work I've done and the work between existential risk. And also I hadn't done very much work which was, to put it, more obviously valuable from like outside of philosophy kind of context. And so I sort of found these ideas quite fascinating. But honestly, it was, I was on the job market. There was this fascinating looking postdoc. And so that was my sort of entry into it. So it's not as if I spent time sort of going, oh, wow, what about existential risk? But rather it was something I fell into, which is one of the fun things, I guess, of having an extremely competitive job market, is that you end up doing things you never dreamed that you would end up doing. I was very happy that it turned out like that.
Yeah, no, I'm really happy that it also turned out like that. So we'll round back to existential risk in a little while here. But first, I want to understand that sort of that initial motivation from sort of like philosophy into this trying to understand epistemology and the questions of knowledge, really, and how that led you directly. Because I understand the connection between that and science. It's a very robust method for uncovering facts about the world. But how did that bring you to paleontology specifically?
Yeah, well, there's sort of two answers. There's the sort of autobiographical answer, which was my PhD was originally on questions of reduction. So I was interested in looking across like the philosophy of mind, the philosophy of science and metaphysics, thinking about the way that, and thinking about, how do questions of reduction play out across these areas, so on and so forth. And typically when people think about reduction, it's in a very sort of time slicey kind of way. You've got your psychology about the mind and your neuroscience about the neurons and da-da-da. It's these hierarchies. And I started thinking, well, what would happen if you thought about these things sort of, as it were, horizontally rather than vertically? If you were thinking about, what does reduction look like in geology, right? Where geology is interested in these like massive timescales. And so I started thinking about, going and reading a bit of geology and paleontology. And I suppose my PhD had there was the bit where it was about reduction, then there was a bit where it was about reduction and dinosaurs. And by the time I started reading about dinosaurs, I then went, okay, now it's just dinosaurs. Like the things that originally interested me about reduction sort of fell to the wayside, and I sort of went all in on paleontology.
Yeah, that's really fascinating.
So the connection between, the other answer, this is the more philosophically reflective answer, is simply that I'm very much, in a way, a traditional philosopher of science, which is to say the things that really motivate me are questions about scientific success, right? Science is this remarkably sort of transformative institution, I suppose, or set of institutions that have a very shallow history, right? If you're talking about science proper, you've only got a good 300 or 400 years to work with, and yet so much has been achieved. And there's a tendency for philosophers, when they're thinking about that, what you do is you focus on the kind of grand achievements. You go and you look at Isaac Newton, or you go and you look at Einstein, and you look at very particular aspects. If you're a philosopher of biology, you'll tend to go and look at the great achievements in biology. You go and look at sort of DNA and the molecular revolution and these kinds of things. And I thought, well, maybe there are, because I was like, well, let's go and look at a science that philosophers haven't thought all that much about. which isn't to say I'm certainly not the first philosopher to care about paleontology. People like Carol Cleland and Derek Turner most explicitly, and Martin Rudwick, who's more of a historian, but historian philosopher, have looked at it before me. But the thought was just, well, these are sciences that just seem to be doing different, they're in very different situations, right?
Yeah.
Being a paleontologist is quite different to being a, particle physicist. And so that's the sort of base motivation, is if you think that science is a heterogeneous, very human kind of thing, then you can't just go and look at what happens in the most successful labs and say that's how science works, that's why science is successful. So my base question is, how and why is paleontology successful when it is successful?
Mm-hmm. And what's the standard for success in that context? When you say when paleontology is successful, what does that actually mean?
It's a great question. So you might say something like this. I'm not going in with a explicit notion of what success looks like. Rather, I'm going in with some preconceptions, often success is like, oh, wow, you learned a cool thing. Or, this was a very productive question. Lots of really interesting new knowledge came out of following this hypothesis. And then my ideas about what successful science looked like were shaped by looking at paleontology. So when you go in to look at a science sort of, as it were, more or less naively, or maybe if you're a philosopher of science who hasn't really looked at much science, you tend to think, oh, a successful science is when you've developed a consensus around a particular proposition, right?
Yeah.
The dinosaurs were made extinct by a big rock hitting the earth. That's success when it's robust evidence and this kind of thing. And looking at paleontology has really changed my view on that. I now think that, at least in the right context, consensus is significantly less interesting and less. It's not necessarily a sign of success. It's often a sign of nothing interesting happening there. It's the cases where you have people flying off in different directions, where you have speculation, that I find to be signs of success, because it's in those areas that you really start surprising yourself, where science starts developing new ideas, new models, new perspectives.
And I find that interesting, because I feel like a lot of times in the sciences, right, this sort of STEM revolution that's really influenced how people look at education, and it's people go to school, become engineers, and it's this heavy focus on utility of knowledge, which I think is one of the reasons why I personally was drawn to philosophy. It's like, it's not necessarily about the utility, it's about that sort of reformation of how do you define success in these fields, how do you define progress in these fields, and what am I actually doing it for? And it sounds like those moments of discovery and those moments of interesting insight into our evolutionary past and our past as a collection of species on this rock flying through space, that is a fantastic mark of success. And I want to know a little bit more. You mentioned it a little bit on your website, but you talk a little bit about the sort of narratives that historians and history sort of brings up. And could you just talk a little bit more about how the relationship between what narratives we have about history, how they emerge perhaps, and how maybe the sciences influence those, or any direction you want to take with that specifically?
Great. I mean, there's a lot in there. So
I did it because I was like, I don't know where he wants to take it. So I just want to.
There's a lot of directions you can think about narratives. So I often think about narratives in a very simple-minded way. Like, in many ways, I'm not a very deep philosopher. I'm pretty shallow. So what is a narrative? Well, a narrative is really just a causal sequence. It's me saying this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, with some becauses thrown in there, right? It's a trajectory of some kind, right? And so narratives are used all the time in the sciences. We've got a huge amount of narratives floating about right now about the coronavirus pandemic, right? There's various different stories about where it came from, how it spread, why various countries have responded differently and then had different upshots. These are all narratives, which are one way you can think about them as ways of making sense of extremely complex events. That's when narratives come into their own, because they're sort of stretched across time and contain these multiple elements. So I'm able to integrate economic, public health, etc., things into this one narrative that I wouldn't be able to do, perhaps, if my explanation was just narrative. And so, sorry, I'm trying to double check why you can't hear me. Can you hear me now?
Oh, I can hear you. Yeah, I can
Oh,
hear you.
okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay. For some reason,
Not
Skype just said I can't hear you, which is quite baffling.
weird. Okay.
But oh well, you can obviously hear me, so I'll continue. Maybe this will get edited. I'm not sure. So the so we have these various narratives. What they're good at is explaining complexity. One of the things that have really struck me about paleontology and other historical sciences that are interested in the deep past, is the way that narratives tend to evolve over time. And the way that they tend to evolve is from quite simple narratives, often sort of what I call one-shot hypotheses, right? So we've already used the great big rock killed the dinosaurs, right? Very simple narrative. How come the dinosaurs died? Great big rock hit the earth. Boom, we're done. And you start with a bunch of these competing hypotheses that are equally simple, right? Volcanoes went off, killed dinosaurs, we're done. You know, if it's the early 80s, new virus turns up, pandemic, all the dinosaurs die, you know, off we go. Over time, these things get both complexified and knitted together. So now you'll find some paleontologists and geologists defending the idea that actually it was both the great big rock hitting the earth and the volcanoes going off that were critically important. But also what mattered was various changes within ecosystems at that time that made them less resilient. And so you go from these very simple, very kind of, in some sense, psychologically satisfying kind of narratives, because they go, oh, here's the one thing that made the difference.
Yeah. Here's the identifiable thing that caused all of this.
Yeah.
It muddies the water. It creates more causes for that potential, for that specific phenomena.
That's right. And so you sort of move from the simple to the complex. And that's, in a way, quite different from our usual picture of science, right? Because you're supposed to provide laws that kind of unify all of these various things. I can explain, you know, all of the mass extinctions because they're all the same type of event. It turns out that's just not right. It turns out that mass extinctions are events that occur under very particular circumstances, and those particular circumstances are often different. There may not be general things to say about them. And so narratives come into their own when we're dealing with these highly complex, kind of unique sort of events.
So when taking that and moving to existential risk more broadly and global catastrophic risk, that's something the field really needs to figure out is I mean, I know there's the technical definitions, but they're used so interchangeably. But those narratives that you hear, you know, talked about in past extinction events, right? Was it the Permian extinction? Like there's 6 or 7 big ones, at least from my rough understanding. And we have all these narratives, like you're saying, about them, and generally, as we learn more, they grow more complex. What have you been able to identify from that understanding of narratives and sort of how they work within paleontology and other sciences? How has that affected your interpretation of the last several months of COVID, as well as other existential risks and global catastrophic risks, and just impending issues to our world?
Good. So surprisingly a lot, actually. So
really, okay, good.
It's unsurprising that I've been thinking a lot about pandemics and catastrophes and existential risks over the last sort of 3 or 4 months. But I've been surprised at how much the ways that I've thought about historical sciences kind of really feed into my sort of experience in thinking about these things. So there's a bunch of ways. So I'll just rattle off some things if that works. So one is a sort of sense of, let's call it temporal scope. When you're a paleontologist, you're thinking about what's often called deep time or deep history. When you're thinking about catastrophic risks, you're thinking about, you know, the deep future in certain kinds of ways. So one of the things which is often, that's the way of putting this, kind of a bit horrifying when you work on things like existential risk is you find yourself thinking things like, well, you know, this looks pretty bad, could lose 5 to 10 million people. That's an awful thing to happen. But, you know, in the grand scheme of things, because you're taught to think on this extremely long time scale. So psychologically, there's this kind of weird effect often where you get this sort of distance. But at the same time, by thinking about deep time, you start thinking about, rather than particular events, you start thinking about the resilience of systems. You start thinking about the way that different systems are able to withstand shocks. So for me, one of the interesting questions in light of things like, the pandemic is, well, what are the features we can pick out of various countries that have done quite badly, right? And often what comes out is the systems that they have are just not very resilient.
Yeah.
A very easy one is it turns out that if you're running your health system on a maximized efficiency for normal circumstances, if that's your model, which is the model for most centrally run, so nationalized health systems. I'm not going to speak to the US because that's too confusing. That means that your system is simply not built. It doesn't have enough buffer to deal with these kind of big influxes. And there's sort of very general lessons in a way to be learnt from that aren't specific to particular events, which is you need to have a lot of give in these systems because every now and then something crazy is going to happen. And it's worth it to have a system which is more resilient, more robust, than to, in the short term, kind of try and optimize it to, normal conditions.
Yeah.
And weirdly, I think thinking about history sort of tells you that. There's one more. Okay, so the other one is the notion of normality. Mm-hmm. I'm going to make some generalizations about humans. This is certainly my experience. I have a tendency to look at the world around me. Most of the time, I go, this is normal. The example I always sort of go back to, and this is very autobiographical, is my experience of starting grad school, where you turn up at grad school, you're like new kid, and there are people who showed up 2 months ago. So far as you're concerned, they've always been there. There are people who have been there for 5 years. They've been there for as long as the person who's been there for 2 months, because the way things are when you turn up, that's the way things are. And it takes a period of time for you to actually get that sense of history.
Yeah.
We tend to sort of take our sort of first impressions or take the way the world around us to be normal, to be the way that things are and also ought to be, right? Normal has that dual meaning.
Yeah, exactly. Yep, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Normal. Yeah. And this one thing that's really interesting about, say, the pandemic, but also interesting about looking at paleontology, is you discover that normal is extremely limited in scope, and normal can change very quickly. So one of the examples I've worked with a fair bit is thinking about what's sometimes called the Middle Cretaceous terrestrial revolution, where basically a very approximate way of putting it is you go from a world which is mostly dominated by, in terms of megafauna, by cycads, by ferns, and by sauropod dinosaurs, to a world dominated by gymnosperms, by flowers. So you get, there are no flowers. If you go back 100 million years, no flowers. They don't exist. And then over the period of, say, 20 million years, you get a combination of the Gondwana breaking up, but also flowers emerging and radiating really quickly, right? You end up with 80% of the world's macroflora being gymnosperms in the space of, I don't know how many millions, some millions of years. But this is a really dramatic change, because then you get bees, you get various types of insects, you also get radiations in birds, radiations in mammals, because there's a whole new ecosystem opening up. And so you go from just these two totally different normals, right? And then this current normal has lasted for about 100 million years, which is remarkably stable, right? But these things evolve and come from somewhere. And I think when you're thinking about human culture, and you think, because we're somewhat in control of what the normals are.
Yeah.
One of the things that history, I think, can teach us is that it's kind of not the case that there are things that have existed since time immemorial, or at least if there are things, there are few of them and they're hard to find, hard to identify. And this leads you to think, well, actually, one, this idea that, oh, well, this very safe, secure world, by we, I mean a very select set of people living in the West, or the global North, if you want, have lived in, is not some kind of permanent, some kind of something which is just the world's going to swing back to, right?
Yeah,
it's something that needs to be maintained.
Yeah, exactly.
And also, that thing could also be changed, right, in sort of positive ways if necessary. So I think history teaches us about impermanence. That's one way of putting it.
And I think that's really interesting. very, very many reasons. But I'm really fascinated by how power works in society, right? That's always something that I'm really grips me. And there's the economic arguments, there's the governmental arguments. Like there are a ton of arguments of trying to figure that out. But I think one way that oftentimes is not inspected as thoroughly as it should be is how is power maintained through the stories that are prevalent within the culture. And one of the most obvious aspects of that, and this is the aspect of any revolution or any political awakening, anything that fundamentally transforms how society operates, it always starts with a questioning of those norms. It always starts with the questioning of the things that everyone collectively goes, this is how it ought to be. This is how it is. And once again, that connection between this is how it is and this is how it ought to be. So I find it really interesting that looking at these massive time scales can sort of elude that truth, which is so present as the siren going by, which can elude this idea that's so prevalent in human society when it comes to how we actually create effective change. And what I'm interested in about is how, and I want to hear more about your specific studies at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk. It was with technological advancements, right? What was it? What was it specifically?
I was kind of spread across, but the my sort of main project was on the relationship between science and existential risk. So it was less about technology per se, although I did do some stuff on, say, geoengineering. The project was more about the sort of social structure of science and the kind of and what a science of existential risk might look like, and how those two things interact, or rather fail to interact.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure.
What were your findings when it comes to how a science of existential risk should look?
Yeah. So the big line I really tried to push was to do with science being far too conservative in certain ways. What I meant by conservative was something quite specific, which is that the range of questions and studies you might do if you're a scientist are extremely limited. And they're limited by what you might think of as the sort of social economic sort of material circumstances of science. If you're a scientist, there are many forces, many incentive forces, but also sort of pedagogical forces, like how you're taught, which really don't lead you to, as it were, think outside the box very much, right? So if I want to have a career as a scientist, what I need to do is spend a very large amount of time at university, then a very large amount of time doing more or less sort of grunt work, depending on the kind of scientist I am, in sort of labs during PhD and postdocs, that kind of thing. And this really, teaches you and enculturates you in a certain way of seeing the world, a certain way of conceiving of problems and conceiving of solutions, which is fine, actually. Like that's necessary and powerful. Same thing happened to me when I was becoming a philosopher, right? People kept giving me certain problems and rewarding me when I solved them in certain ways. And so I end up kind of getting positive reinforcement, and then that's how I solve problems now, and that's how I think. And that's good because that gives a community cohesion, it lets people talk to each other, so on and so forth.
Yeah, and it also allows the problems to be presented in a way that has a certain grammar to it, right? Because it's difficult to fix all problems if there is no standardized way of trying to approach them, right? You don't even know how to present those questions to begin with.
Exactly.
Yeah,
it can't be
a lot of times freshmen in philosophy classes go to ask a question and they somehow feel like they asked the question wrong almost because they aren't familiar enough with the grammar to know how to even orient their words. So I can see why that's really effective for creating cohesion. Sorry, but continue.
No, that's right. But then when you think about, like in addition to these kinds of pedagogical processes, you also have just the sort of cutthroat world of what's required to be a practicing scientist. You've got to get money, you've got to get publications, and so on and so forth. And quite often, almost all the time, the way that you get publications and get money is by getting the approval of your peers, right? Peer review is a way of making sure that the work you're doing meets the standards of that community. Now, what that does is it means that as a scientist, you want to go for the surer bets. You want to go for the things that are more likely to succeed, where success is prescribed by this relatively narrow community. So what that leads to is basically, one way of putting it is that this is a very, very good mechanism if you know what to look for. If you know where the sort of cool things are, then this is brilliant because it's going to be very good at precisely hitting the things. Now, if you think about a science like the study of existential risk, where we have no idea what, it's like, I think, most people, when you think about it for a bit, will agree that it's something very worth thinking about.
Yeah.
There might be a debate about how many resources go towards it, but certainly it's worth thinking about.
Where?
But
Yeah, absolutely.
within the sort of social structure of science, it's extraordinarily hard to go, I'm going to do scientific work on something about which I can't really do many experiments. It's not clear what's going to count as data, right? That kind of science is inherently risky and inherently messy, which are things which look like terrible bets given the social structure of science. And so a lot of my work at Caesar was about kind of articulating that and then thinking, a bit about how it might be changed, what kinds of things might be shifted. And a lot of that becomes significantly more prosaic, right? That's more like, well, maybe there should be more grants which are not peer reviewed. Right? Maybe there are ways of looking at alternative methods of scientific publishing that have a different type of filtering system. I know that peer review is something which is often held up as this kind of gold or platinum standard by, frankly, people who aren't scientists and haven't gone through peer review processes. I think it might be a good system for certain contexts, but we need to think about other ways of doing science, or at least structuring science to allow people to do work in more speculative areas.
Yeah, and the issue, as you were talking about earlier, it seems to be that because existential risk is not only such a new field, I know there was existential risk done, but with different words given to it when it came to nuclear weapons and the Manhattan Project. Like I personally consider that to be one of the first projects of trying to stop an existential risk from affecting our species. Was this group of scientists that came together and were like, no, we should not have nuclear weapons. But like recently, the explosion amount of resources and time and just centers to research existential risk, it's kind of causing me to feel like it's growing into this sort of golden age of study. And I think the difficulty there is, as you were talking about earlier, the difficulty in any academic setting is how do you create the right narratives about the field itself to not only incentivize more people to come into the field, but more importantly, allow more effective research and cooperation within it. And I think we have a very novel issue when it comes to, as existential risk interested individuals, obviously of much more credentials, many more credentials than I do in that capacity. But we have a novel difficulty where it comes to like how do we tackle these issues, not both just institutionally, but also collectively as individuals, when it comes to things that you can't, you can't study AI in a formal way that we're used to. It's projections. You study certain parameters of it, and then you apply into the future and say, well, here's what might happen. And when we're trying to convince not only the public, as well as policymakers and business people to invest resources into mitigating some of these things, without a formalized rhetoric for existential risk, I think that task is almost impossible. I think there needs to be centralized ways of actually reaching out to the people in power to create the right narratives to actually be able to fulfill change.
I mean, I think one thing that I was going to mention earlier when you talk about narratives that I might bring up now, which I think is kind of, there's a lot of things to say to what you just said, but one thing to sort of point out is that one of the ways that I've worried about narratives with existential risk, or and particularly technological risk, is the lack of narratives, particularly those that the public and policymakers have. There's a notion from sort of feminist epistemology called sort of hermeneutic injustice, which is this kind of idea that the quick way of putting it is the concepts that are available to you and available to the community that you're in can play a sort of positive or negative role in the way that your life goes. So if I don't, one of the ways in which I'm incredibly privileged is that as a sort of white male, white middle class, insert any level of privilege you want, I've basically got it. That gives me a large amount of, as it were, narratives I can fit myself into. There are many different lives I can lead. And, possession of those concepts make a material difference because that's how I can see myself in there, and moreover, how the community I'm in will allow me to do so. And so one interesting level of injustice is differences in those narratives. You can apply that to sort of technology as well, right? When we're thinking about AI, one thing which is very striking, for instance, is anytime there's a journalistic article about AI safety, there'll be a photograph of a Terminator on it. Because you can see exactly why. Someone's scrolling by, you want something that's going to grab their attention, and there's some real problems with policymakers and the public having a notion of, oh, well, AI danger is sort of Skynet. That's the worry. Or it's not even, one of the worries is often it's not Skynet, it's killer robots, right?
Yeah.
And the idea that killer robots is the worry is kind of really implausible. Well, let's be careful. And so I think one of the jobs that I think an X-Risk community should be doing is trying to increase the number of narratives, right? Get away from these sort of utopian or dystopian sort of narratives about AI and start giving a sort of, so just having more narratives and more concepts gives you more tools to work with when you're trying to build towards a certain future.
So it seems like in the same way that political change, real political change, begins with an awakening in the population that comes from questioning the status quo, and the injection of new narratives, new stories of what can be. It sounds like with Existential Risk, we need to have a pipeline between the research itself and what narratives the research propagates and actually spreads. Because in many other fields, take philosophy as just one, the origins of it, there was a faster track between the powerful in the society and the thinkers. Not necessarily at the beginning, but over time, like Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. Like there was a faster pipeline between the ideas of the field and the findings of the field to the narratives and the things that sort of instantiate those narratives as prevalent in the society. And it sounds like with Existential Risk, it's a challenge to be able to say, we have all these notions, for example, of AI, which I think is a wonderful example. Whereas our findings, even like the idea of like the paperclip maximizer, right? That it seems to be much more of a realistic risk right now from our current findings than killer robots, And I think that without those proper narratives, without that pipeline of discovery of here's this thing that's interesting and a risk, to here are the notions that politicians, wealthy people in the private sector, and most importantly, the public have to be able to conceptualize these things. That pipeline needs to be there. It needs to be built.
I mean, it's an interesting question. So, what I found and what sort of we found at Caesar, at least while I was there, was there are real challenges with communications about existential risk and finding those kinds of pipelines. And often it's because those pipelines almost inevitably lose subtlety. So one of the sort of, I want to call it like a sort of trope or even sort of a meme really about what it's like being an academic trying to engage with policymakers is that as an academic, you write a 10,000 word paper. As a policymaker, you want 5 bullet points. I mean, there's a sort of, often that dialogue is had in terms of, oh, well, this means the academics need to learn to talk in bullet points. And, I mean, to some extent that's true. But I also think that, one way of putting this is if to the extent that the public, but particularly policymakers, are thinking within small time windows, then it doesn't matter how much we make noises about the importance of having resilience into the longer term. There are no real incentives for anyone to actually take those seriously or care about them. Because if you're asking to take them seriously, then it's a question of taking resources that could be used to help people now. Right? In order to have a more resilient sort of group, resilient society, whatever, into the future. And that's almost an impossible discussion to have if the other person simply isn't sensitive to those things. And to be frank, policymakers, people within, so politicians are only going to be interested if the pressure is put on them, and people working within public institutions are only going to be interested in if that falls within the mandate of that public institution.
Yeah.
Like regardless of how much passion the individuals might have, I tend to think that those structures are going to be what makes a difference. And so I think it's not just a matter of building pipelines of communication, it's also about building ecosystems, as it were, that are open to these kinds of answers. Something I did want to quickly sort of note, I just wanted to use something you said earlier that I thought was really interesting, was this notion of, well, it does look like you've got a bunch of these, different centers popping up. In the last sort of 5 or 6 years, it's like mushrooms sort of turning up sort of everywhere.
Yeah, I'm starting one at my own university, actually. Yeah.
Right.
So,
yeah, and there's a question about, one, why is that happening? And then another question about, what are the things we should look out for? And what are the things we should worry about? There's a notion from, let's call it sort of bioecology, called a founder effect. A founder effect is when you have an island, say, and the critter that turns up on the island is relatively random, right? It's just whoever happens to fly there or whatever. And that small population that arrive on that island are going to have sort of contingent properties, right? But because they're the first ones there, and because it's not clear who else can get there, they then spread around the island. And this is a really interesting mechanism for developing kind of quite different features from an island population versus a population on the mainland. I think in academic cases, we get founder effects as well. Existential risk, as you pointed out earlier, is kind of was sort of started as a kind of academic discipline, and so which is a bit strong. Maybe a beginning to be an academic discipline, who knows? Very much by sort of philosophers and other sort of theoreticians. And that's led it to have a particular kind of look and feel, right?
Yeah.
It's been very interested in very, very abstract theoretical arguments, things like, lots and lots of attention to the Fermi equation, lots and lots of attention to, these sort of arguments that have very little connection to the world, so far as, you can kind of tell. And they're very often extremely powerful arguments, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Those arguments are, it's quite difficult to sort of work out what might be wrong, or for that matter, what might be right about them, because they're so disconnected. And something that I found as a sort of philosopher of science who, I tend to have to ground my work in going and looking at what scientists do, because otherwise I'm lost. Those arguments I found extremely just so abstract that I was like, well, I don't really know what to do with these. And I think this has changed. It's starting to change, right? There are more people who have training in things like ecology and public policy and law, who are starting to sort of feed into this. I think that's good, because although the philosophy is all very, it's important stuff and it's a good job, at the same time, it's really important that this doesn't become a sort of playground for philosophers who are enamored with cool theoretical arguments.
Yeah, and it's really, it's not quite irony, but it still has the same tinge of it, where we're dealing with a field that is, and this is what initially prompted my interest in it, is we're dealing with a growing academic discipline, if we want to call it that, that is concerned with the arguably the most important ethical questions and the most important issues facing our species. It's how the field defines itself. And I think because of that, to keep it in a realm of sort of just the theoretical, of the difficult to implement into sizable action, it's incredibly challenging. And for me personally, it's difficult to look around me and say, okay, I want to start this institution at my university, and I want to work with these researchers, and I want to do some research. But the question is what should the ratio be between, research, the studying of these things, the sort of construction of these almost like field-like parameters of grammar and the way we talk about these issues, and sort of the field's growth, and the sizable action, the focus on the actual mitigation, the focus on the steps that we take, and understanding how we take one and move it to the other. And it's challenging. And, for me personally, it's like, how much time do I invest in the research itself? And, how well can I truly understand this thing? And what's the ideal sufficient understanding of this thing before I can actually understand how to mitigate it sufficiently, right? Because it's really easy to fall into this trap of I should just spend all my time trying to understand all the scientific nuances of this specific risk and completely eclipse the actual steps that need to be taken. And I mean, specifically with climate change, the specific risks that we're facing from climate change, are a decade, 2 decades off before we start seeing some serious potential for like combining of different risks, including the ones from climate change, creating a very bad situation for society. So it's like how, that ratio is just really tricky to get right? That chemistry recipe.
Yeah, I suppose there's sort of two things to say about that. One is, of course, it would be a mistake to think about what should I do when you're thinking in that kind of broad sense, because of course this is a question about distribution across individuals and so forth. It's a population level question, not a individual level question. And like I often think that questions about sort of resource distribution in that way are important, but they're also in some sense kind of limited, because they tend to not lead you think about how might you structure things differently, right? It sort of assumes, oh, I'm either putting stuff in here or I'm putting stuff in here. And it assumes that there's sort of this limited pool of resources and I'm trying to optimize my distribution across them. And that's not necessarily the way things go, right? Sometimes you can change the nature of the resources. So for instance, it's not obvious that thinking about short-term and middle-term risks needs to be detached from thinking about long-term risks. Stuff about resilience and robustness and these sort of systemic level features can carry across those different things. Another thing to sort of worry a little bit about is I worry a lot about thinking about efficiency in this kind of way. So there's this idea, if only I had the right sort of technocratic system such that I was able to identify the right ideas within the sciences and then have this nice funnel going from those sciences into policy. And I think that there's a couple of problems with this. One is that scientists, by and large, don't know boo about policy, right? Climate scientists now, some of them, after many years of not being very good at this, now have a really good grip on this because they've had to, they're trained in it. There are sort of skills involved. And so it's not just simply a matter of going, scientific result pipeline policy. The other worry about it is this idea that you could have any kind of grip or predictions on what's important. This is the thing that worries me a lot when we're thinking about efficiency and optimization and so forth, when we're thinking about academic work in particular, but other work as well. It's this idea that there's the valuable stuff and the less valuable stuff and the stuff that's a waste of time. And this is an extremely dangerous, of course I would think this is an extremely dangerous way of thinking, right? Because what it leads you to do is to think, well, you mentioned earlier the sort of STEM stuff, right? I think, what's happened in the last sort of 2 or 3 years with the breakdown in public trust of government and science in various sort of countries in the global north is a beautiful example of why maybe we should care a little bit about academic pursuits that teach you how to interpret things as opposed to, and how to reflect on things. And how to be kind of skeptical in a sort of the relevant sense as opposed to in a sort of knee-jerk way. It turns out that the sorts of things you learn in STEM are important things, but they're not the be-all and end-all of what's required. Similarly, if you're thinking about research in terms of, well, I want the things that are going to have, in the UK, the highest impact, you're going to be emphasizing particular types of knowledge and particular types of outcome. And I tend to think that insofar as you can, diversity is going to be critically important here, partly for the questions you've already talked about in terms of narratives, partly because of that. Right? If you have a system which emphasizes engineering solutions, then you're going to get engineering solutions, where engineering solutions tend to be focused on optimizing towards a particular value.
I have some finishing questions. They're supposed to be rapid fire, but please take your time with them if you want to. So what's a book that you recommend? What's a good book that you would recommend
Oh,
anyone?
wow.
I know, right?
Golly. Um, that is a really difficult question.
Explain the nuances of narratives and history and
Oh,
science and global risks. Uh, easy to answer, but your favorite book, that's a
oh my
little bit more
gosh.
challenging.
Yeah, that's oh yeah. What's the philosophy book? I'll name two philosophy of science books
Okay.
that I've read recently that I think everyone should read. One is very well known, the other one is less well known. So Martin Rudwick's classic, The Great Devonian Controversy, is a beautiful sort of romp through the sort of history of early geology with these very, very deep philosophical lessons. Um, the other one, which is a very much shorter book, is Derek Turner's recent book, Paleoaesthetics, which has a look at the role of aesthetic values in the sciences, in particular in paleontology, and sort of gives these very bold, fascinating arguments about the importance of understanding aesthetic sensibilities and values and understanding scientific success.
Those are two fantastic recommendations. I gotta write them down. All right, the next question is, uh, okay, bear with me on this one. This is my favorite question to ask people. If you had one single question to understand the qualities about a person that you find to be the most important, or the most interesting, what question would you ask them to get to the heart of who they are?
Describe your best friend.
Oh, I like that. Well then I have to ask you it. Describe your best friend.
I should have seen that coming. I was like, that's a hard question. Like, what have I done to myself?
Well, it's a brilliant question I like to add too. It tells some very important traits I can already start picking up on.
Now I have to work out who my best friend is.
Oh, that's the hardest one.
I think this is going to be really this is going to end up being really soppy. So I think my best friend is my partner Kirsten, and she is incredibly creative and caring. She's also a philosopher, so we share a lot of interests, and we kind of work together in these ways, and we enjoy sort of building things together and thinking about the way our lives can be. So we're both people who like sort of thinking into the future and imagining the way that our lives could be together. And I think that's a critically important part of why we sort of fit together the way that we do. And we like to have fun.
That makes me that's such an endearing, wonderful answer. I love that. Um, let's. Then the next question is there's two more after this one. If you could go back in time and give your past self a piece of advice, let's say graduate school seemed to be a very influential time for you. So as you're entering graduate school, that first day where you're still trying to uncover the hidden histories of everyone there, what advice would you give to yourself then?
Um, Probably at that point it would be something like, do you know what? I don't think I would give myself any advice. Um, the reason is I think that uh, I it's been a pretty rough decade. It's been a hard 10 years. But I'm not really sure whether or not someone telling me something
Yeah.
about how to do it or what to do would have been particularly helpful. You know, I tend to think that advice is only useful if someone's going to actually follow it.
Do you then given the ideal recipient of advice, let's say hypothetically there was a young person out there wanting to go into existential risk or studying
Right.
philosophy or
Good.
something like that.
Yeah, okay.
What
So what
advice would
advice
you
would I give? Yeah. Um, yeah. One way of putting it is when you're trying to be an academic, there are various decisions you make which make things easier and harder for you. One thing that makes it harder is, as it were, taking sort of roads that are somewhat less trodden. And I've been very privileged in that a lot of my research has gotten to go down those roads. And the reason I've been able to do it, I think, has been a lot to do with the kind of social background, the way I present myself, and these kinds of things. So I guess the general advice is kind of come to understand as best you can the kind of person you are, and how you're fitted and how you are presented and how you fit within that society, and use those advantages as well as you can. And be aware that if we're talking about academic discipline, diversity is what we want. And so any way that you can do something which is doing something new or doing something in a different way, do your damnedest to do it, but also be aware that in doing so, you often make things harder for yourself.
Yeah, why would you? I oftentimes find myself trying to. I reflect on the most interesting things I've ever done, and I think every single time the unifying feature in each of them is that it was something that was abnormal or weird or a little bit quirky or a little bit eccentric, or more importantly, a little bit less done than some of the other paths that were sort of delineated before me. I think that generally that's a really good thing to keep at heart. So I definitely will keep that in mind when I'm going through my academic career. So thank you for that. And then, are you? This will be a really fun one. Are you hopeful for the future of our species and our world, coming from someone who's worked with some of the people who are studying the threats that we're facing? Do you have hope?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of the psychological version of that question and the epistemological version. For me, I think these sort of come together. So I certainly have hope, but it's hope of a very it's a very hard-edged hope in the following kind of way. I tend to think that for there to be mass changes to society that are ones we choose as opposed to ones that just happen to us, there needs to be it needs to really, really have an effect. So when you think about something like climate change, in order for people to really take this seriously, it has to start making a difference to your mortgage payments or interest rates, or at least, in the West, that sort of thing. My hope is that things get bad enough such that people have to take real action to change it, but not so bad that there's no going back, or rather, there's no mitigating, right? And so I tend to have a dim view of our capacity to sort of grab the reins and really take ownership and as societies and groups to sort of make these changes until things have gotten bad. My hope is that sort of needle point between things being bad enough for us to really, really change what we're doing, while not being so bad that we fall off a cliff, is forgiving.
I think that waking up point is really important, and it's going to be interesting to see what that point is, because we saw with COVID, some societies, some systems are a little bit more lenient when it comes to waking up and actually listening, and I really appreciate that answer.
So maybe a final thing to say, just to illustrate that with the COVID stuff, I think something we should be paying a lot of attention to are the sort of narratives that people are building and could build around this virus, because the pandemic at some point will end, and one possible narrative that some people are already brewing, specifically kind of politicians who have seriously screwed up, is a narrative that says something like, oh, well, this is something we could do nothing about. This is a natural event. This is something which, just happens now and then. And that's, in a way, a kind of comforting narrative if you don't want to change anything. Because if you've got no control over it, then you can't change it. And I think that that's an incredibly difficult, a very dangerous sort of narrative to start sort of spreading, right? And so I think that being very conscious of what lessons we want to draw from this is really, really important. And one way of thinking about it is, it would be wonderful it's, of course, great tragedy. This is that X risk thing again of being like, well, 12, so what? This number of people died. But it would be wonderful if this could serve as a kind of wake-up call, at least in a public health context, but maybe broader, that just says, hey, look, these big changes, these big events do occur, and we need to build societies that are able to mitigate and react to those things. It doesn't have to be that we get to the very edge of destruction before we do something about it. There are examples of us not doing that. But the right lessons have to filter through. And I suspect a lot of very powerful people have a very strong interest in the right lessons not filtering through.
Because it maintains the current structures that are benefiting them. And I think that's one of the reasons why philosophy at this point in human history is so critical, because we have to take these conscious understandings that we sort of present ourselves with when it comes to how the world works, what the world is, what the world ought to be, those narratives. And there's going to need to be some serious reformations and some serious adjustments to the narratives that are prevalent in our world today. And it's concerning to be someone seeing so many of those narratives not being propped up, and also not being propped up in response to such a global disaster. And I really hope we can get to the end of this century and beyond with these risks not being primarily bared by the most vulnerable in society, and that we can make sure that we build a society that works not only for the people who it's meant to work for, i.e. the most powerful, which it's working great for, but also works for the people, and refine the system to serve the people who are most likely to bear the most weight of these obstacles that we're facing. And I think if we can do that, we can keep our humanity intact, and maybe find a little bit more humanity to hold on to. But I want to thank you very, very much for meeting with me. It was a really fun conversation.
My pleasure, Coleman. It was lovely talking to you.
Thank you very much.